Are you ready to step into the shadows and hear stories that will send chills down your spine? Welcome to real ghost stories that will haunt you forever. These are the terrifying, bone-chilling encounters shared by real people who dared to confront the unknown. From eerie whispers in the dead of night to shadows that defy explanation, every tale will leave you questioning what's lurking in the dark. So dim the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself. And hey, if you survive the scares, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your own ghostly encounters in the comments below. Who knows, your story might be in the next video. Rain pattered against the cobblestones of Boston's Beacon Hill, the city's historic streets cloaked in gray. Maxine Harper, a novelist on the brink of giving up her dreams, trudged through the drizzle, her tattered notebook tucked under one arm. She was supposed to be working on her next big idea, but inspiration had abandoned her. The success of her first book was now a distant memory, and with her savings dwindling, she couldn't afford another failure. As she wandered aimlessly, a flickering neon sign caught her eye. Grimoire and Company, an antiquarian bookstore she'd never noticed before. Drawn by the promise of warmth and the faint glow spilling onto the sidewalk, she stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of aged parchment and varnished oak. Books lined the walls in precarious stacks, the titles on their spines barely visible in the dim light. A frail man behind the counter glanced up from a ledger, his pale eyes locking on hers. He didn't speak, only offered a faint nod as she ventured deeper into the labyrinth of shelves. That's when she saw it, a battered leather-bound book displayed on a pedestal near the back of the shop. Its cover was cracked with age, the faded gold title barely legible. Epitaphs of the Damned. Maxine reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the surface. The leather felt unnervingly warm. "Ah," the shopkeeper said from behind her, his voice a dry whisper. "That one has been waiting for someone like you." Before she could question him, he was at her side, sliding the book into her hands. "No charge," he murmured, retreating into the shadows. Back in her tiny apartment, Maxine settled in with a glass of wine and the mysterious book. Its pages were filled with stories that were dark, beautiful, and hauntingly vivid. Each one left her breathless. The first tale was about a man haunted by a specter that lived in his reflection, slowly replacing him in the eyes of others. Another told of a woman who sewed the names of her enemies into a cursed quilt, only to find her own name stitched into the fabric one morning. The stories felt alive, as though they were reaching out to her. By the time she reached the end of the third tale, her hands were shaking. She realized she hadn't touched her wine. A strange unease crept over her, as though someone or something was in the room with her. That night, she dreamed of a dark forest where whispers coiled like smoke between the trees. A figure with hollow eyes beckoned her deeper into the woods, where an ancient book lay open on a stone altar. The next morning, her cat, Pepper, was nowhere to be found. She searched every corner of the apartment, but it was as though the feline had vanished into thin air. That was only the beginning. Over the next week, the line between fiction and reality blurred. Shadows lingered in her peripheral vision. The stories in the book began to mirror her life in unsettling ways. When she read about a cursed typewriter, her own began typing on its own in the dead of night. The faint sound of keys clacking woke her from sleep, and when she approached, the paper bore a single word: write. One stormy evening, Maxine reached the final story in the manuscript. It was titled The Scribe. The protagonist was eerily similar to herself, a writer who stumbled upon a cursed book and found herself unable to stop writing. As she read, a realization crept over her. The details of the story were changing. aligning with her own life. Maxine's pulse quickened. The story ended with the protagonist disappearing, her soul absorbed into the pages. She slammed the book shut, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights in her apartment flickered, and a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles on her desk. "Right," a voice rasped. She turned to see the manuscript open again, its pages fluttering wildly despite the absence of any breeze. Her pen was on the desk and it rolled toward her, stopping inches from her hand. The shadows in the room thickened, coalescing into a towering figure with hollow eyes and elongated fingers. "Your story isn't finished," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Terrified but unable to resist, Maxine sat at her desk. Her hand moved on its own, the pen scrawling words across the paper faster than she could comprehend. She tried to stop, but it was as if invisible hands were guiding her, forcing her to pour out a tale of despair and horror. The room around her seemed to melt away, replaced by an endless void. The only light came from the pages before her, and the whispers of countless voices filled the air. They were the voices of those who had come before her, trapped in the manuscript's cursed grip. When Maxine's landlord entered her apartment days later, concerned by the lack of response to his calls, he found it empty. Her laptop, notebooks, and cat were gone. All that remained was the manuscript on her desk. The final story was newly written in Maxine's handwriting. It detailed the fate of a writer consumed by her own creation, her spirit forever bound to the cursed book. The manuscript disappeared soon after, only to reappear weeks later in another city. A bookstore owner in Chicago reported finding it inexplicably on his shelves, waiting for its next victim. And somewhere, Maxine's voice echoed faintly from within its pages, begging for release. There are forests that are ancient and mysterious, but then there are those that seem to breathe. A presence so heavy, it suffocates everything within its reach. This story takes place in one such forest, nestled on the outskirts of a remote European village. To the villagers, it was known only as the Valewood, a name whispered with reverence and dread. For generations, the Valewood had been more than a dark patch of trees. It was the guardian of an unspoken pact, a chilling bargain struck by their ancestors. Stories told of strange figures in the shadows, of those who entered the woods and never returned, and of whispers that carried on the wind. The warnings were clear. Never stray beyond the old stone arch at its entrance, especially after dusk. But Eliza, an adventurer and lover of the paranormal, had never been one to heed warnings. When she arrived in the village, the locals seemed hesitant to even meet her gaze. Their hushed conversation stopped as she approached, and their refusal to speak about the Valewood only deepened her curiosity. She had come searching for stories, but what she found was a silence weighted with fear. That fear wasn't enough to stop her. Armed with a lantern, a notebook, and an insatiable need for answers, Eliza made her way to the edge of the Valewood one misty evening. The crumbling stone arch loomed above her, its surface covered in moss and carved runes that seemed to pulsate in the fading light. The moment she stepped through, it was as if the forest exhaled. The air became colder, thicker, and the sounds of the outside world faded to nothing. The forest floor was unnaturally soft beneath her boots, muffling her footsteps. As she ventured deeper, she began to notice oddities: trees twisted in impossible shapes, patches of ground where no vegetation grew, and an eerie quiet that seemed to amplify her every breath. Her lantern flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. She felt a growing unease, as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. Then she heard it, the first whisper. It was faint, a mere rustle among the leaves, but it was enough to make her stop in her tracks. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, but it was not one voice. It was many. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, all speaking at once in a language she couldn't understand. They surrounded her, yet when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Eliza pressed on, heart pounding. After what felt like hours, she emerged into a clearing. At its center stood an enormous tree, its roots gnarled and stretching like skeletal fingers into the earth. The bark was dark, almost black, and carved deep into its surface was a strange, jagged symbol that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The air around her grew oppressive, pressing against her chest as she approached the tree. She reached out instinctively to touch the symbol, but a sudden burst of movement stopped her. From the corner of her eye, she saw something shift in the shadows. It emerged slowly. A figure, or rather, something pretending to be a figure. Its form was fluid, constantly changing, as if it were made of smoke and darkness. It had no face, but its presence was suffocating. Tendrils of shadow extended from its body, snaking along the ground toward her. The whispers grew louder, no longer outside, but inside her mind. "You are not welcome," the voices hissed. "You have disturbed the balance." Eliza stumbled backward, her lantern trembling in her hand. "I didn't mean to disturb anything," she managed to say, her voice shaking. The figure tilted its head in a mockery of human curiosity. Its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her wrists and pulling her closer to the tree. Panic surged through her as she realized she couldn't move. Her lantern fell to the ground, its light dimming. In the flickering glow, the earth at the base of the tree began to shift, as if something beneath it was alive. Then she saw it, a small, weathered box half buried in the soil. The whispers changed, their tone no longer angry but desperate. "Free us," they begged. "Break the pact." With a surge of adrenaline, Eliza yanked her arm free from the shadow's grip and clawed at the dirt around the box. Her fingers scraped against the brittle wood as she pulled it free. Inside was a parchment covered in runes, its edges blackened as if it had already been burned once. The shadow figure recoiled violently, its form flickering and unstable. The whispers screamed in unison, "Destroy it!" Eliza struck a match with trembling hands and held it to the parchment. The runes glowed an eerie red as the flames consumed them. The forest seemed to convulse around her, the ground shaking and the trees groaning as if in pain. The shadow figure let out a bone-chilling wail, its form disintegrating into the air like ash. As the last ember of the parchment burned away, the oppressive weight lifted. The forest was silent once more, but it was a different silence, calm, almost peaceful. The twisted shapes of the trees began to straighten, their bark losing its unnatural black hue. Exhausted and shaken, Eliza stumbled back through the forest. When she reached the stone arch, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. She turned back for one last look and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The ancient tree, once looming and dark, was gone. In its place stood a small sapling, its leaves shimmering in the morning light. The night was suffocatingly quiet, as if the world had paused just long enough for something unseen to slip through. 12-year-old Evelyn lay awake in her creaky bed, listening to the rhythmic ticking of her bedside clock. Sleep had been elusive in this house since they'd moved in 3 months ago. It was beautiful from the outside, Victorian style with tall windows and intricate woodwork. But inside, the walls seemed to whisper. Tonight felt different, though. The oppressive quiet carried a weight, like the silence wasn't just empty, it was watching her. Evelyn had always been skeptical of anything supernatural. She prided herself on being logical, a little stubborn, and entirely too curious for her own good. Her friends called her brave, a future detective, and she relished the label. But bravery felt like a distant memory here. Something about this house stole it from her. The little things had started almost immediately. Lights flickering, cold spots in the hallway, the faint sound of footsteps when no one was around. At first, her parents dismissed her concerns with a laugh. "It's an old house, Evie," her dad would say. "It creaks, it settles." But Whiskers, her cat, had no such excuses. He refused to set a paw on the staircase, let alone enter her room. She didn't blame him. Evelyn shifted under the covers, trying to convince herself that the sensation crawling up her spine was nothing more than an overactive imagination. Her gaze darted to the far corner of her room, where shadows clung stubbornly, refusing to yield to the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Then she heard it, a soft creak, unmistakable. Her heart stuttered. It wasn't the casual creak of a house settling. This sound carried weight. Someone, or something, was there. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No answer. She gripped the edge of her blanket and turned her head slowly toward the corner. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The darkness seemed deeper there, heavier, like the shadows had solidified into something tangible. And then she saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, barely distinguishable from the surrounding blackness, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly so, with shoulders that seemed to slope unnaturally. Its outline wasn't crisp. It blurred at the edges, like smoke refusing to take a solid form. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't sway. It simply stood there, a void within the darkness, and she felt its gaze on her. It had no eyes that she could see, yet she knew it was watching her. The air felt heavier with every passing second. She wanted to scream, to call for her parents, but the sound wouldn't come. Her muscles refused to obey, leaving her paralyzed in her bed. The only movement was her chest rising and falling rapidly as panic took hold. The figure leaned slightly forward, just enough to make her pulse race faster. It was subtle, deliberate, as though it wanted her to know that it could move when it chose to. Evelyn's mind raced. Was she dreaming? Was this sleep paralysis? She'd heard of it before, read about it even, but this felt too real. The chill in the air, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath the figure's weight, the oppressive dread pressing down on her chest, it all screamed reality. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she stared at the figure. She couldn't blink, couldn't risk taking her eyes off it. She felt like prey, cornered and helpless, with a predator biding its time. Her fingers twitched under the blanket. If she could just reach her bedside lamp, maybe the light would chase it away. Slowly, inch by inch, she moved her hand toward the lamp's pull chain. The figure straightened. Evelyn froze. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out every other sound. The figure didn't take a step, didn't make a sound, but she felt it. An unspoken warning. Somewhere in the house, a loud crash shattered the silence. Evelyn's scream finally tore free as her bedroom door burst open, flooding the room with light. Her parents stood in the doorway, eyes wide with alarm. "What's wrong?" her dad demanded, rushing to her side. "The corner," Evelyn gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "There was someone there." Her father turned, his expression hardening as he scanned the room. The corner was empty, the shadows now benign. "It was just a dream," he said, though his voice carried a nervous edge. "No, it wasn't," Evelyn insisted, tears streaming down her face. "I saw it." Her mother sat beside her, stroking her hair. "It's okay, sweetie. It's over now. You're safe." But Evelyn knew better. The next day, while helping unpack boxes in the attic, Evelyn stumbled upon an old photo album. Curious, she flipped through its brittle pages until she froze. One photo caught her eye. a sepia-toned image of her bedroom taken decades ago. In the corner of the room stood the shadowy figure. Evelyn's stomach churned. She ran to show her parents, but when she opened the album again, the photo was gone. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn kept the lamp on. Sleep didn't come easily, and every creak of the old house felt like a reminder. The figure might be gone for now, but it wasn't done with her. Art has always held the power to evoke emotion. But in a prestigious urban gallery known for its eccentric exhibits, there was one collection that evoked more than admiration. It inspired unease. Known as the Frozen Whispers, this series of lifelike sculptures captured raw human distress. Every piece seemed to freeze its subject at the height of a moment. A scream caught mid-shriek, eyes wide with terror, hands forever clutching at unseen threats. The detail was so precise it bordered on eerie. The sculptor, known only as the Midnight Sculptor, was anonymous, their identity a mystery that intrigued art critics and the public alike. Among those captivated by the unsettling exhibit was Clara Bellamy, an investigative journalist with a knack for uncovering hidden truths. Clara wasn't just drawn to the artistry. She was haunted by the resemblance between the sculptures and people recently reported missing in the city. As the stories swirled, Clara grew increasingly curious and uneasy. She started digging, but the Midnight Sculptor left no trail. No interviews, no records of past works, not even a rumored studio location. The more she searched, the more elusive the sculptor became. Then, late one night, while reviewing police reports and staring at the missing persons board she'd pinned to her wall, Clara's phone buzzed. An anonymous text lit up her screen. "Visit the gallery at midnight. All will be revealed." Her pulse quickened. Who could have sent this and why? Against her better judgment, Clara grabbed her coat and set out into the city, her curiosity overriding her fear. The streets were eerily quiet as Clara arrived at the gallery. The familiar white building loomed in the moonlight, its large glass doors standing ajar. Inside, the space was darker than usual, with only faint emergency lighting casting ghostly shadows over the sculptures. Clara stepped in, the echo of her boots on the marble floor reverberating through the empty halls. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Slowly, she made her way toward the exhibit, and then she saw it. At the center of the room stood a sculpture that hadn't been there before. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was a woman, her face locked in an expression of utter terror, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. It was detailed, lifelike, too lifelike. And then Clara noticed the worst part. The woman looked just like her. Before Clara could move, the temperature in the room plummeted. She could see her breath fogging in the faint light. A noise, a faint whisper, carried through the air. At first she thought it might be the wind, but as it grew louder, she realized it was a voice. "Welcome to my collection," the whisper said. Clara spun around. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man tall and gaunt, dressed in a long dark coat. His eyes glinted unnaturally in the dim light, and his hands were pale, almost translucent. "I've been waiting for you, Clara," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You've been following my work for some time now, haven't you?" Clara's mind raced. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Who are you?" she managed to stammer. "I am an artist," he replied, gesturing to the sculptures around them. "I capture the essence of fear, the raw emotion of a soul in its final moments. You've seen it, haven't you? The detail, the life in their eyes. That's because they are alive. Each one of them. Alive." Clara's heart pounded as realization set in. You're saying these people, they are preserved, the sculptor interrupted. Frozen in time. Their fear immortalized. Clara's instincts took over. She turned and bolted toward the gallery's exit, her footsteps echoing wildly in the empty space. But the door slammed shut before she could reach it. She pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but the city outside seemed impossibly far away. The whispers returned, now louder and more insistent, surrounding her. The lights flickered, and when she turned back, the sculptor was standing just inches from her. "You'll make a fine addition," he said, his voice soft but menacing. Clara screamed as shadows swirled around her, pulling her toward the pedestal. Her vision blurred, her body frozen as an icy numbness crept through her limbs. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the sculptor's calm, satisfied smile. The next morning, the gallery opened as usual. Visitors streamed in, marveling at the lifelike sculptures. Among them was a new addition, a woman standing with her hands outstretched, her face frozen in terror. No one questioned the brilliance of the piece. No one wondered where the midnight sculptor found such inspiration. And no one noticed that the gallery staff reported a new missing person that same day. Deep in the heart of Millhaven Forest lies Ravensbrook Asylum, a place as cursed as it is forgotten. Built in 1889, the asylum was meant to be a sanctuary for society's most troubled souls, but quickly descended into a house of horrors. Under the iron rule of Dr. Elias Thorne, patients endured unspeakable treatments that blurred the lines between medicine and torture. In the 1920s, after a series of mysterious deaths and an unexplained fire, Ravensbrook was shut down, its grim legacy buried beneath a veil of silence. But legends are not so easily forgotten. Whispers of ghostly apparitions and screams echoing through the night have persisted, daring only the brave or the foolish to explore its decaying halls. For Sarah, a 28-year-old urban explorer with a love for the macabre, Ravensbrook is the ultimate prize. Sarah assembles her team. Mark, a reserved historian obsessed with uncovering the truth about the asylum. Rachel, her spirited best friend who seeks adventure wherever she can find it. And Jason, a skeptic who views the paranormal as mere theatrics. Each carries their own reasons for venturing into the asylum. But for Sarah, it's more than just curiosity. She's always felt drawn to forgotten places, believing that their stories deserve to be told. They set off just before dusk, the narrow road twisting through the dense forest until they reach a rusted gate half swallowed by vines. Ravensbrook looms in the fading light, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the bruised sky. The windows are dark and hollow, and the once grand facade is mottled with moss and decay. As they cross the threshold, it feels as though the asylum itself is holding its breath. Inside, the air is thick with mildew, and every step stirs a cloud of dust that catches in their throats. Flashlight beams slice through the oppressive darkness, revealing fragments of the asylum's haunting past. Rusted bed frames, torn restraints dangling from the walls, and graffiti scrawled by past trespassers. Mark leads the group to the archives, eager to find records that might shed light on the asylum's dark history. As they sift through brittle papers and moldy files, the mood shifts. Mark discovers a journal written by Dr. Thorne himself. The entries begin clinically enough, detailing patient treatments and experimental procedures. But as the pages progress, the tone grows unhinged. Thorne writes of unlocking the soul, describing his methods in chilling detail. Sensory deprivation chambers, chemical injections, and isolation that pushed patients to madness. The group becomes uneasy, but Jason shrugs it off. It's just a bunch of old stories, he mutters, brushing past Sarah to explore another room. Moments later, a loud crash echoes through the corridor. The group rushes toward the sound, finding Jason standing frozen, his flashlight trembling in his hand. On the wall is a message scrawled in what appears to be blood: "Leave or suffer the same fate." Jason insists it's a prank, but the others aren't so sure. As they continue deeper into the asylum, the building seems to come alive. Doors creak open on their own. Footsteps echo where no one walks. Whispers drift through the air, their words unintelligible yet chilling. In the main hall, they find a massive mural painted on the wall. It depicts Thorn surrounded by shadowy figures, their faces twisted in agony. Mark notes that Thorn believed his experiments allowed him to harvest fragments of his patients' souls, which he claimed would make him immortal. The group exchanges uneasy glances, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing moment. Their exploration leads them to the basement, where the air is damp and suffused with an acrid metallic scent. At the end of a narrow hallway, they discover a door that appears untouched by time, its iron surface gleaming in the dim light. Carved into the metal are the words, "Sanctum of the Eternal." Jason pushes the door open with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a circular room lined with ornate mirrors. Each mirror reflects scenes from the asylum's darkest moments: patients screaming, Thorn grinning maniacally as he injects them with unknown substances, and shadowy figures writhing in torment. The reflections seem alive, their eyes locking onto the intruders. Rachel gasps, pointing to a mirror that shows her own reflection. But something is wrong. Her reflection isn't following her movements. Instead, it begins to smile, its grin widening into an unnatural, malevolent leer. Suddenly, the mirrors begin to vibrate, emitting an ear-splitting hum. Shadows pour out from the glass, coalescing into a tall, skeletal figure, Dr. Thorn. His hollow eyes burn with malice, and his voice reverberates through the room. "You dare disturb my sanctuary?" Sarah, gripped by fear, realizes Thorn's power is tied to the mirrors. She screams for the group to smash them. Jason hesitates, frozen in disbelief, while Mark begins swinging a heavy pipe at the glass. Each shatter releases a deafening scream, and the shadows in the room writhe in agony. As Sarah swings at the final mirror, Thorn lunges at her, his claw-like fingers grazing her arm. She smashes the glass with all her strength, and Thorn lets out a bone-chilling wail before his form disintegrates into ash. The room plunges into silence. The group stumbles out of the asylum just as the first rays of dawn break through the trees. Their faces are pale, their breaths shaky. Sarah clutches her camera, unsure if it captured any evidence of what they endured. Back home, Sarah reviews the footage. One photo sends chills down her spine, a shot of the circular room taken before the mirrors shattered. In the corner, barely visible, is Thorn's face, staring directly at the lens. The story of Ravensbrook Asylum reminds us of the enduring scars of cruelty and obsession. While the group escaped with their lives, they know some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. In a sleepy, unassuming town nestled between rolling hills, the old Monroe house stood as an ominous landmark. Locals avoided it, whispering tales of mysterious sounds and shadowy figures seen through its shattered windows. The house had been abandoned for decades, yet it felt alive, as if waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. Among the locals, the house was known as Whispering Walls. It was a place of urban legend, a place where, according to town lore, the walls absorbed the cries of its long-dead occupants. But legends were nothing more than ghost stories for children. Or so most thought. When Sarah, Mark, and Emily, a trio of thrill-seeking teens, decided to explore the Monroe house one Halloween night. They didn't believe in ghosts. They were chasing adventure, maybe a little notoriety. "If we make it out alive," Mark joked, "we'll be legends." Sarah, the pragmatic leader of the group, wasn't easily swayed by the supernatural. She saw the trip as a chance to debunk the myths and add another adventure to her journal of rational explanations. Mark, her best friend, thrived on adrenaline and dared to tread where others wouldn't. Emily, however, was the wild card, a girl fascinated by the occult and secretly hoping they'd encounter something unexplainable. Their reasons for entering the Monroe house were different, but their resolve was the same. They wouldn't back down, no matter what they found. The three teens stood before the house, its once proud exterior now a decaying relic. Ivy crawled up its walls, and broken shutters flapped in the cool night breeze. The air felt heavier here, as though the house exhaled a long-forgotten sigh. "Ladies first," Mark said, holding open the rusted gate. Sarah rolled her eyes, stepping forward. As she pushed open the door, it let out a groan, louder than they'd expected, as if the house were waking up. Inside, their flashlights illuminated warped floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and a grand staircase whose once carved banisters were now cloaked in dust and cobwebs. "This place is eerie," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the creak of their footsteps. They wandered through the rooms, the air growing colder as they ventured deeper. Their flashlights cast elongated shadows that seemed to move even when they stood still. Mark paused by a framed photo, its glass cracked, but the image intact. A family of four smiling stiffly, their eyes too intense to feel natural. "Creepy vibes confirmed," he muttered. In the parlor, they stumbled upon an ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and smeared with grime. Sarah shone her flashlight onto the glass, revealing their reflections. But something was off. Behind them, in the mirror's world, the house appeared restored. The wallpaper was pristine, the furniture polished. "Is it showing the past?" Emily asked, stepping closer. Mark snorted. "It's probably just an old trick of the glass or something." But as they stared, a figure materialized in the reflection. Tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadow. It didn't belong to any of them. It stood silently in the corner of the room within the mirror. Emily gasped. "It's looking at us." The figure raised a hand, not in a wave, but as if commanding them to stay still. Then it moved, drifting closer to their reflected selves. Sarah turned her head to check behind them, but the corner was empty. Only in the mirror was the shadow real. "We need to go," Sarah said firmly, her voice shaking. But Emily stepped forward. "Wait, what if—" "Now!" Sarah barked. Reluctantly, Emily followed as they made their way upstairs. The staircase creaked and groaned as if protesting their intrusion. On the second floor, they were greeted by a hallway lined with closed doors. "Which one first?" Mark whispered. Sarah pointed to the nearest door. "Let's just get this over with." The room was a child's bedroom, perfectly preserved. Toys were scattered on the floor, and a small bed was neatly made. It felt lived in, as though its occupant had just stepped out moments before. Then the whispering began. It started as a faint hum, barely perceptible. Slowly it grew louder, resolving into voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The whispers overlapped, forming a chaotic symphony of cries, laughter, and anguished pleas. Emily froze. "Do you hear that?" Sarah nodded, gripping her flashlight tighter. "Let's leave. Now." But before they could move, the door slammed shut. The whispers turned into a crescendo of piercing wails as the walls began to shift and groan, as if the house itself was alive and angry. The air thickened, pressing down on them like a weight, making it hard to breathe. The child's bedroom began to distort. The neatly arranged toys twisted into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes, and the once inviting bed transformed into a dark, gaping void. "Sarah, what's happening?" Emily cried, her voice trembling. Mark pointed at the wall. "Look." The wallpaper peeled away, revealing layers of rotting wood beneath, etched with claw marks and words carved in frantic, looping script. "Help us," repeated over and over again. Dark, viscous liquid began to seep from the walls, pooling at their feet. The temperature plummeted, and their breath came out in visible puffs. Then the figure returned, but it was no longer the sorrowful woman. It had grown taller, its form more monstrous, limbs unnaturally elongated, with hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to burn with malice. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "You disturbed the silence!" The figure shrieked, its voice reverberating like shattering glass. The shadowy figure raised an arm, and the liquid on the floor surged upward, forming spectral hands that reached for the trio. Sarah grabbed Emily, pulling her away as Mark swung his flashlight wildly, trying to break free. But the hands wrapped around their ankles, their icy touch burning like fire. "We're sorry!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "We'll leave. Please let us go." The figure leaned closer, its glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. "You don't leave. You belong to the house now." The floorboards beneath them began to splinter, creating a swirling vortex of shadows and despair. Objects from the room were sucked into the dark whirlpool, a stuffed bear, a music box, and finally the bed itself. "Hold on to me!" Sarah yelled, grabbing Emily and Mark as the vortex pulled at them with unrelenting force. But Emily froze, staring at the figure as tears streamed down her face. "It wants something. It's missing something." "What?" Mark shouted. "I don't know," Emily cried, her voice desperate. "But it's not just angry, it's broken." Sarah, thinking quickly, reached into her backpack and pulled out the cracked photo Mark had taken from the parlor. She threw it into the vortex. The figure paused, its eyes locking onto the photo as if seeing it for the first time in ages. For a moment, everything stopped. The figure shrank back, reaching for the image, its twisted features softening into something almost human. And then, with an ear-splitting scream, the vortex imploded. The trio was thrown backward, landing hard against the wall. When they opened their eyes, the room was still, silent. The three stumbled out of the house, shaken and bruised, but alive. As they reached the gate, Sarah glanced back. The house looked just as decrepit as before, its windows dark and empty. But in one of the upper windows, she saw the faint outline of a figure, a woman holding a photograph, watching them leave. For weeks, the three didn't talk about what had happened. Mark deleted the photos he'd taken in the house. Emily refused to drive past the Monroe property. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't done with them. Late at night, when the wind blew just right, she could swear she heard whispers, reminding her that they'd left something behind. Growing up, I never believed in ghosts. I mean, sure, I loved a good scary story around the campfire, but the idea of something lurking just out of sight, that was for movies, not real life. At least that's what I thought, until one ordinary night proved me wrong. I was about 10 years old, living in a small 2-story house in the suburbs. It was cozy, if a bit creaky. My parents always said the creaks were the house settling, whatever that meant. Our bathroom was at the end of a narrow hallway, right across from my room. The hallway always felt a little colder than the rest of the house, but I never thought much of it. That night, I had just finished dinner and headed upstairs to get ready for bed. I went into the bathroom, flipped on the light, and started brushing my teeth. The mirror above the sink reflected the hallway behind me, so I could see the door to my bedroom. It was a normal night, quiet, routine. But then, as I glanced at the mirror, something caught my eye. Someone walked past my bedroom door. It wasn't a blur or a shadow. It was a person. I could see them clearly in the reflection. A man in dark pants and a plain shirt. His gait was slow, deliberate. He didn't even glance at the bathroom. He just walked straight into my bedroom and disappeared out of view. At first, I didn't panic. I figured it was my dad. He had this habit of popping into my room to grab his phone charger or check something before bed. So, I spat out my toothpaste, rinsed my mouth, and called out, "Dad?" No answer. I walked out of the bathroom and looked into my room. It was empty. I checked the closet under the bed. Nothing. My heart started to race. I turned and called out again, louder this time, "Dad?" From downstairs, I heard his voice reply, "What?" A chill ran down my spine. I practically bolted down the stairs to the living room where my dad was sitting on the couch watching TV. My mom was next to him, completely engrossed in her book. "You were just upstairs, right?" I asked, my voice shaky. He gave me a confused look. "No, I've been down here the whole time." "Why?" I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy? "There was someone in my room," I finally managed to stammer. My dad frowned, stood up, and followed me upstairs. Together we checked every room, every closet, even the attic, but there was no one there. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure walking into my room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew logically the house was empty. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. It was too vivid, too real. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I catch my reflection in a mirror. Because now I can't help but wonder, what if something's watching me from the other side? I'll never forget that night. It was the kind of experience that makes you question everything you know about reality. I was driving home from a work trip, and the highway stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., but the dark, empty road made it feel much later. The only sounds were the hum of my car's engine and the occasional rustle of trees swaying in the wind. It wasn't the first time I'd taken this route, but something about it felt different. The air felt heavier, the darkness seemed thicker. Maybe it was just my imagination, but as I turned onto a narrow stretch of road cutting through dense woods, a chill ran down my spine. The heater was on, but I still felt cold. I glanced at the dashboard and saw the temperature inside the car had dropped significantly. Strange, I thought. Maybe the thermostat was acting up. I adjusted the heat and tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. Then I noticed it, the rearview mirror. I don't know why I looked at it, call it instinct, but when I did, my heart stopped. There in the back seat was a shadowy figure. Its shape was indistinct, like it was made of smoke or shadows. But there was no mistaking it. I wasn't alone. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I forced myself to glance back at the mirror, praying it was just a trick of the light. But it was still there, sitting motionless in the middle of the back seat. I pulled the car to the side of the road so fast that the tires screeched. My hands were trembling as I turned to look directly at the back seat. Nothing. It was empty, no figure, no shadow. Just the familiar sight of my jacket tossed carelessly across the seat. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. But as I sat there, staring at the empty back seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still there. The air felt heavy, oppressive. It was as if the car itself was holding its breath. Reluctantly, I got back on the road. The shadow was gone, but the cold remained. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, my stomach twisting every time I caught a glimpse of the back seat. I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then it happened again. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the mirror. The shadow was back. This time, it leaned forward, as if trying to whisper in my ear. I swerved the car in panic, narrowly avoiding a ditch. When I finally dared to look again, the shadow was gone. I didn't stop again until I reached home. I ran into the house, locked every door, and turned on every light. I spent the night sitting on the couch, clutching a baseball bat, waiting for the sun to rise. I still don't know what I saw that night. Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of sharing my car with something I couldn't explain. I sold that car a week later. I didn't care how irrational it seemed. I just couldn't bring myself to drive it again. When I started college, I was thrilled to move into my first apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom in an older building near campus. The place had its quirks: creaky floors, old-fashioned fixtures, and a slightly musty smell. But it was mine, and I was ready to make it feel like home. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I was busy with classes and settling into the rhythm of college life. But then, small things started to happen. At first, I brushed them off. A pen I was sure I'd left on my desk would show up on the kitchen counter. Lights I distinctly remembered turning off would be on when I returned home. One evening, I was reading on the couch when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I lived alone, and the building wasn't particularly soundproof, but this sounded too close, too distinct. I got up, peeked out into the hallway, and saw nothing. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but the incidents kept escalating. At night, I'd hear faint whispers, almost as if someone were mumbling just out of earshot. I'd lie frozen in bed, straining to make out the words, but they were always too muffled. The turning point came one night around 3 a.m. I woke up suddenly, a heavy feeling pressing down on my chest. My room was freezing, much colder than it had been when I went to bed. And then I saw it. At the foot of my bed stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and indistinct, more like a dense, dark fog than a solid person. My breath caught in my throat and I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but it was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Or at least, I felt like it was watching. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow began to dissipate, melting into the darkness of the room until it was gone. The moment it disappeared, the oppressive cold lifted, and I could move again. The next day, I started researching the building's history. I discovered that a previous tenant, a young man, had died there under mysterious circumstances. The details were vague, but the story was enough to confirm my suspicions. I tried to stick it out, convincing myself that I was imagining things or that it was just a residual energy from the past. But the activity continued. Footsteps, whispers, objects moving. Every night felt like a battle against unseen eyes. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke my lease and moved out, leaving the apartment and its ghostly occupant behind. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that shadowy figure and the overwhelming sense of being watched. Growing up, my childhood home always felt different, like it held a memory that didn't belong to my family. It wasn't the creaks of the old floorboards or the occasional draft that sent chills down my spine. No, it was something less tangible, something that lingered in the corners of my mind when the house grew quiet. It started with the footsteps. Late at night as I lay in bed, I would hear the distinct sound of someone walking in the attic above me. Not just the random settling noises of an old house, but actual deliberate steps. My parents assured me it was nothing, just the house breathing, as they called it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. You see, the attic was sealed. The only access was a panel in the ceiling of the hallway, nailed shut and untouched for years. One night, the footsteps were louder than ever, pacing back and forth above my bed as though someone was restless. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound to go away. Eventually, it stopped, but that was just the beginning. I remember waking up suddenly one night, my body frozen with a fear I couldn't explain. The air in my room felt colder than usual, heavy with a strange stillness. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that felt out of place. And then I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed was a shadowy figure. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination playing games. It was real. The figure was faint, but I could make out the shape of an old woman, her posture slightly hunched as she stared directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. After what felt like an eternity, she began to fade. Her outline blurred, and then she was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness with only the sound of my pounding heart. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, but the memory of her presence was too vivid, too real. I told my parents about the footsteps, about the woman in my room. They dismissed it as overactive imagination. Years later, after we had moved out of the house, I found out something that chilled me to my core. While doing some research about the neighborhood, I came across an old article about the previous owners of the house. The last occupant before us was an elderly woman who had lived there alone for decades. She had died in her sleep, in my bedroom. It all made sense then. The footsteps, the cold air, the figure at the foot of my bed. I wasn't imagining it. She had never really left. Even now I think about her sometimes. Was she angry that we had taken over her space? Or was she simply watching over the house she had loved for so long? I'll never know. But one thing is certain. Some places hold on to their memories, and some memories refuse to fade. I never considered myself someone who believed in the paranormal, but what happened during one of my late-night shifts as a security guard completely changed my perspective. It started on a cold, quiet night when I was called to cover for a colleague at a site I'd never worked before. The building was a sprawling, empty complex, eerily silent, except for the occasional hum of the HVAC system. My job was straightforward: patrol the premises and ensure everything was secure. Equipped with a flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and a set of old keys, I made my rounds, checking every door, every corridor. The first hour passed uneventfully. I wandered through the dimly lit hallways, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The monotony of the job had almost lulled me into a sense of calm, until I returned to the small security office to review the surveillance footage. On one of the monitors, something caught my eye. A shadow, vague and shifting, moved across the screen. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the lighting or a glitch in the camera. But as I watched, the shadow moved with purpose, slipping in and out of view as though it was traveling through the building. Adrenaline spiked. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Grabbing my flashlight, I set out to investigate. The building's silence suddenly felt oppressive. Every creak of the structure amplified in the stillness. I searched methodically, room by room, floor by floor, but found nothing. No open doors, no signs of forced entry, and most disturbingly, no one else in the building. I returned to the security office, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But when I rewound the footage, my blood ran cold. The shadow hadn't just been moving through the building. It had been following me. On the monitor, I saw myself walking down a hallway, my flashlight casting long beams ahead. But behind me, just out of the flashlight's reach, the shadow crept, mirroring my movements. It paused when I paused, turned when I turned. It was as though it was studying me, staying just far enough back to avoid detection. Panic set in. I didn't know whether to leave or stay. Rationality told me it was nothing, a technical glitch, a reflection, anything but what my gut was screaming at me. But deep down, I knew this was no glitch. Determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I continued my patrols, this time hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every flicker of light, every distant sound felt charged with meaning. And though I never saw it directly, I felt it. The weight of eyes on me, the cold sensation of being watched. The shift eventually ended, but the experience stayed with me. Even now, I think back to that night, to the shadow that followed me, and I can't explain it. I've tried rationalizing it, dismissing it as a trick of the mind, but the footage doesn't lie. I don't work as a security guard anymore, but I'll never forget that night. Whatever was in that building wasn't human, and it wasn't something I was ever meant to understand. You've braved the unknown and heard some of the most spine-tingling ghost stories ever told. But the question is, can you sleep tonight? If you enjoyed the fright, make sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss a new video. And remember, the paranormal doesn't always stay in the story. It might just find you next. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep your lights on.